Hi there, and welcome back to LeanReads, the channel where we share powerful insights and personal growth lessons through great books. Between 1940 and 1941, as Nazi Germany rained destruction upon Britain, Winston Churchill faced an impossible question. How do you lead when defeat seems inevitable? In The Splendid and the Vile, Erik Larson shows us not the legend, but the man, flawed, eccentric, brilliant, who turned defiance into destiny. If you enjoy what you hear and want to dive deeper, we've included a link to the book in the description below. Now, let's get started. After Nazi Germany's swift conquest of France in 1940, Adolf Hitler turned his attention across the English Channel to Britain. His goal was not total destruction, but submission. He wanted a neutral, compliant United Kingdom so he could focus on his grander ambition, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On September 7th, 1940, 300 German bombers descended upon London, marking the beginning of the Blitz, 57 consecutive nights of air raids that would continue until May 1941. In The Splendid and the Vile, 2020, Erik Larson masterfully recreates this harrowing period, not through the lens of generals and strategy alone, but through the eyes of Winston Churchill, the newly appointed British Prime Minister. Larson doesn't just chronicle war. He captures the psychology of courage, the resilience of ordinary citizens, and the charisma of a man who refused to surrender, even when defeat seemed inevitable. Though the book focuses on a narrow slice of World War II history, Churchill's first year as Prime Minister, it stands as one of the most vivid human portraits of leadership under fire ever written. Erik Larson is an acclaimed American journalist and best-selling author, known for his narrative, non-fiction style that reads like fiction, yet stays deeply rooted in fact. His works often explore extraordinary historical events through intimate, personal stories. In addition to The Splendid and the Vile, Larson is the author of The Devil in the White City, 2003, a chilling blend of true crime and the Chicago World S Fair. In The Garden of Beasts, 2011, a haunting look at Nazi Germany through the eyes of the U.S. ambassador's family. Isaac's Storm, 1999, a dramatic retelling of the 1900 Galveston hurricane. Deadwake, 2015, about the sinking of the Lusitania during WWI. His gift lies in transforming archival history into emotionally charged storytelling, and The Splendid and the Vile is one of his finest achievements. In the freezing winter of 1940, as Nazi Germany's relentless bombing campaign dragged on, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's trusted propagandist, vented his frustration in his diary. When will that monster Churchill finally surrender? To the Germans, Winston Churchill truly was a monster, a man too stubborn, too unyielding, and too defiant to be broken. Churchill rose to power at one of the most critical moments in British and world history. Across Europe, nations watched in disbelief as Adolf Hitler transformed Germany into an unstoppable war machine. One by one, his armies swallowed Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. In Britain, people clung to the comforting illusion that they were safe, separated by the English Channel, far from the chaos on the continent. Even the most advanced German bombers, they believed, could never carry heavy explosives all the way to London. But that fragile sense of security shattered almost overnight. Less than a week after Churchill became Prime Minister, the unthinkable happened. Germany invaded France. Within weeks, one of the most powerful armies in Europe had fallen. That single event changed everything, not just for Europe, but for Churchill himself. Overnight, he went from a controversial political figure to the man upon whom the fate of the free world depended. It was in this crucible of fear, fire, and leadership that Churchill forged his legend, a story that Erik Larson captures with cinematic power in The Splendid and the Vile. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded France, Britain's closest ally. The war was no longer a distant thunder, it was now at Britain's doorstep. Winston Churchill had just replaced Neville Chamberlain, who had failed in his desperate attempts to contain Hitler's aggression. For years, Britain had lived on the edge of fear, waiting for the inevitable. Most observers believed that Britain didn't stand a chance against Hitler's vast war machine. But Churchill was different. Unlike Chamberlain and nearly everyone else, he believed, almost irrationally, that Britain could win. The first challenge he faced as Prime Minister was not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of his people and across the Atlantic Ocean. Churchill knew that Britain could not survive without help from the United States. To win this war, he had to win over President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The problem? America wasn't interested. To the U.S. government, this was another European conflict, far from American shores. The U.S. Department of the Interior even warned Roosevelt, saying, "That man, Churchill, he cannot be trusted." And to be fair, Churchill was unconventional. He was known to take 2 baths a day, often dictating letters and memos from his tub. If the phone rang, he might climb out completely naked, demanding his secretary pass him the receiver. He would roam the halls of his residence in bright silk robes, puffing on cigars, thinking aloud about war and destiny. But the British people adored him. In his first speech before Parliament, he radiated resolve and grim clarity. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he declared, words that would echo across the nation. From that moment, Britain rallied. The mood in Churchill's government shifted overnight. From secretaries to senior ministers, everyone shared one unshakable goal: stop Germany, defend Britain, win the war. Despite the chaos of the world around them, Churchill's cabinet became a machine of energy, courage, and purpose, fueled by the fiery spirit of a man who refused to accept defeat. Back to the story of Germany's invasion of France. At first glance, the forces on both sides seemed evenly matched, perhaps even in France's favor. The French army was powerful, and the country was protected by the legendary Maginot Line, a massive defensive fortification once hailed as impenetrable. But the unthinkable happened. Somehow, the German army broke through the Maginot Line with alarming ease. The Nazi war machine surged into French territory, and the Allied forces fell into chaos, scrambling to retreat. The French president phoned Churchill with a brief, devastating message: "We have been defeated." After a long silence, Churchill asked quietly, how could this have happened so soon? France's fall left Britain dangling over the abyss. But before Churchill could even think about defending the homeland, he faced an urgent crisis. Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were still trapped in France. The British Expeditionary Force, exhausted and disoriented, retreated to the coastal town of Dunkirk, a narrow corner of France staring across the Channel toward England. Behind them, German divisions closed in. Then came an inexplicable twist of fate. On May 24th, 1940, Hitler suddenly ordered his troops to halt. The pause would later be called a fatal mistake by one of his own generals. But for the British, it was a miracle. 2 days later, Churchill ordered a full-scale evacuation of Dunkirk. He hoped to save 50,000 men, barely one-sixth of the trapped forces. On the first day, only 7,700 soldiers made it out. A bleak beginning. Then something extraordinary happened. Hundreds of private fishing boats, yachts, and civilian vessels set sail across the channel to join the rescue. In total, 887 boats took part, and only a quarter belonged to the Royal Navy. Against all odds, more than 300,000 soldiers returned home alive. Churchill seized on this narrow triumph to rally the nation. There would be no peace talks, no surrender, no negotiation with Hitler. He told his people, "If our island story is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The next day, the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's mighty air force, began its bombing campaign. The skies over Britain were about to turn black. By May 1940, most Britons had resigned themselves to the grim possibility that Germany might crush them, just as it had crushed France. At the center of Hitler's war machine stood Hermann Göring, the ruthless and ambitious commander of the Luftwaffe. From nothing, he had built the most powerful air force in the world. Germany's fleet of fighter planes outnumbered Britain's by 4 to 1, and their technology was far more advanced. The infamous Stuka dive bombers, shaped like metallic lizards of thunder, carried up to 4,000 pounds of explosives, enough to erase entire neighborhoods in seconds. Even more terrifying was Germany's use of radio beam guidance technology, allowing their pilots to hit targets with deadly precision, even through fog or darkness. Britain's air defense systems were powerless under such conditions. London, the beating heart of Britain's politics, economy, and culture, was the inevitable target. After a cabinet meeting, Churchill led his ministers outside, looked over the skyline, and said quietly, "I hope London looks the same 2 or 3 weeks from now." Churchill knew Britain's survival depended not just on courage, but on production. On his very first day in office, he created the Ministry of Aircraft Production, placing his old friend Lord Beaverbrook in charge. Churchill gave him no orders, only trust. Beaverbrook worked around the clock, and the results were astonishing. British factories began turning out fighter planes at a pace that even German intelligence could not believe. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe continued to hammer rural areas and coastal towns, but still avoided London. The city waited, silent, tense, holding its breath. Hitler still entertained the fantasy of a peace deal with Britain, hoping to spare himself a costly invasion. And indeed, to any rational observer, Britain's defeat seemed inevitable. But Winston Churchill was not a rational observer. He was something else entirely, a man who refused to think like ordinary men. At the very moment France fell to Germany, Winston Churchill sent one of the most important messages of his life to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He warned that the threat now extended far beyond France or Britain, that soon a United States of Europe under Nazi rule could emerge. Churchill asked urgently for a shipment of destroyers, calling it a matter of life and death. But he chose his words carefully. There was no trace of despair in his telegrams, no begging, no fear. Churchill's message was clear. Even if the sky fell, Britain would stand firm. Roosevelt remained cautious. To him, Churchill was still an enigma, charming but unpredictable. The United States was officially neutral, and most Americans wanted no part in another European war. Meanwhile, high above the English countryside, the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force, RAF, clashed in the skies. Below, Churchill kept sending cables to Roosevelt, almost daily, steady, composed, relentless. Britain's Ministry of Aircraft Production was working miracles, but Germany still had the edge. Superior machines, experienced pilots, and ruthless tactics. Many Luftwaffe aces had already seen combat during the Spanish Civil War. Britain, however, had radar and something more powerful, a nation fighting for survival. Losing meant invasion, occupation, and the end of everything they knew. When Hitler learned that the Luftwaffe was losing more planes than the RAF, he was furious. He ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the full-scale invasion of Britain, set for August 1940. Before that could happen, he commanded Göring to break the RAF, both physically and psychologically. As the Battle of Britain raged, Churchill refused to give up on Roosevelt. His persistence finally paid off. Roosevelt agreed to send aid, along with a shrewd request. If Britain were defeated, the Royal Navy would fall under American control. To keep America's neutrality intact, Roosevelt arranged the transfer quietly. The U.S. would send Britain a group of old, rusting destroyers in exchange for access to British naval bases across the Atlantic. This secret plan became known as the Lend-Lease Program, a lifeline disguised as a loan. Churchill could finally exhale. The first thread of hope had stretched across the Atlantic. All that remained was for Congress to approve it. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Luftwaffe, found himself deeply confused. His intelligence chief insisted that the Royal Air Force, RAF, was on its last breath, but German pilots returning from missions reported the exact opposite. The RAF was still fighting fiercely. Frustrated, Göring decided to persuade Hitler to approve a massive, all-out assault to finish Britain's air force once and for all. It would be called Operation Adlertag, Eagle Day. But from the very start, things went wrong. On the first day, Göring was forced to halt the offensive because of bad weather, and when the skies cleared, the RAF struck back with surprising precision. British pilots had discovered a crucial weakness. The Stuka dive bombers were most vulnerable during their descent. Exploiting that flaw, they turned the skies into a graveyard for German aircraft. By the end of the operation, the Luftwaffe had lost twice as many planes as the RAF. Churchill was thrilled and puzzled. Could a massive German offensive really fail so quickly? Why, he wondered, hadn't the bombers gone straight for London, the beating heart of Britain? A few days later, he realized the truth. London wasn't the target. The RAF was. If Germany could destroy Britain's air force, an invasion would follow easily, unopposed across the skies. Meanwhile, fear was spreading across Britain. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, exploited every whisper of panic. Civilians began to dread the full moon, believing its light would guide enemy bombers to their homes. Despite the failure of Eagle Day, Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion plan remained on schedule, though delayed by a month. Then, on the night of August 24th, 1940, fate intervened. A group of German bombers, disoriented and off course, accidentally veered over London. Moments later, the first bombs fell on the city. Casualties were minimal, but for Churchill, that single act was enough. At last, he had his justification. The very next night, the RAF struck back, launching its first bombing raid on Berlin. The battle for Britain had just entered a far darker, more explosive chapter. In response to the RAF's daring raid on Berlin, Hitler unleashed his fury. He ordered the Luftwaffe to launch its first deliberate assault on London. For Hermann Göring, it was a dream come true. He finally had the chance to punish Britain once and for all. He called his plan the destruction of London, promising it would be the greatest act of war in human history. But not everyone in the Nazi command agreed. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, believed that the British and Germans were natural allies. He quietly sought a peace deal through secret correspondence, though his efforts would soon be drowned out by the roar of engines. Most of Göring's officers, however, were ecstatic. On the French coast, near the Channel, Göring even hosted a seaside picnic with champagne and binoculars. When the first bombers appeared in the sky, he could barely contain his excitement. Soon, the heavens above were filled with aircraft bound for London. The attack came in 3 waves. The first wave alone included nearly 1,000 bombers carrying high explosives, incendiary oil bombs, and delayed action charges. Sirens began to wail just before 5 p.m. The battle raged all night. By morning, 400 civilians were dead and 1,600 wounded. When Churchill received the first photographs, his face went pale. London was in ruins. Buildings collapsed, streets aflame, smoke curling into the dawn sky. He wept, but the bombing didn't stop. Night after night, the Luftwaffe returned. Air raid sirens screamed. Families huddled in underground shelters, listening to the endless rumble of engines and explosions. From the rooftop of 10 Downing Street, Churchill watched the raids unfold, a cigar glowing in his hand. Even Buckingham Palace was struck by a bomb, though by miracle, the royal family survived unharmed. Still, the RAF refused to break. On September 24th, 1940, a month after the first attack, the skies erupted once again. By the end of the day, the RAF had shot down 183 German aircraft, losing fewer than 40 of their own. It became known as Battle of Britain Day. Hitler finally realized that his dream of crushing London and Britain's spirit had failed. But neither he nor Göring was ready to give up. They would double down, not with strategy, but with rage. The Blitz had only just begun. For the German Luftwaffe, the RAF had become too formidable an opponent. Frustrated and exhausted, Hitler decided to shift his focus eastward. He had long dreamed of crushing the Bolsheviks. In his mind, defeating the Soviet Union would be far easier than conquering Britain. And so, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, was born. But Hermann Göring wasn't done. Determined to leave a scar on Britain's soul, he unleashed one of the most devastating attacks of the entire Blitz. In November 1940, the city of Coventry, an industrial hub in the English Midlands, became hell on earth. The Luftwaffe dropped 500 tons of explosives and 20,000 incendiary devices, killing over 500 people and destroying more than 2,200 buildings. Coventry was left in ruins. Britain sank into a deep financial and emotional crisis. Once again, Churchill turned to President Roosevelt. He reminded the American leader that Britain's survival was inseparable from America's future. He pleaded for food, weapons, and troops, calling it the bare minimum required for our shared destiny. Across Britain, the toll of the Blitz was unbearable. Families who had lost their homes slept in cold, damp shelters. In London, Birmingham, and Coventry, life had become an endless struggle against dust, hunger, and despair. Clementine Churchill, visiting bombed out neighborhoods, wrote to her husband about the heartbreak she saw: children covered in soot, mothers still clutching their ration books amid the rubble. After Coventry, the Germans believed Britain would take months, even years, to recover. But while Hitler turned his eyes toward the vast steppes of the Soviet Union, the British quietly rebuilt. Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess, the lone Nazi still clinging to the idea of peace, was horrified by the destruction. Shocked by the bombing of Coventry, he decided to act on his own. In May 1941, he climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter plane, flew solo across the North Sea, and crash landed in Scotland. His mission: to negotiate peace with Britain personally. It was a desperate, almost delusional act, and it failed. But his flight marked something deeper. Even within Hitler's inner circle, doubt had begun to take wing. Churchill never stopped flirting with America. He sent a telegram after telegram to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, each one a careful balance of honesty, wit, and desperation. One day, while Roosevelt was fishing in the Caribbean, another message arrived, one of Churchill's most urgent yet. It took the president several days to think it through. Then he made his decision. America would act, and this time, seriously. On Christmas Day, 1940, Roosevelt delivered a historic address. For the first time, he used the word Nazi, and for the first time, he spoke openly about Britain's struggle as if it were America's own. If Britain falls, he warned, then the Axis powers will be one step closer to our shores. We will live in fear. The very next day, perhaps by coincidence or fate, the Luftwaffe began to ease its assault on London. By then, over 13,000 Londoners had already lost their lives to German bombs. Churchill remained clear-eyed amid the rubble. He saw the bombings not only as tragedy, but also as opportunity, a way to appeal directly to the American heart. And it worked. Soon after, Roosevelt sent his trusted advisor, Harry Hopkins, to London. Hopkins was frail, thin, sickly, suffering from stomach cancer, but razor sharp and politically fearless. Churchill adored him from the moment they met. He refused to let Hopkins out of his sight, parading him through London's ruins, introducing him to soldiers, workers, and even the royal family. Hopkins, who disliked crowds, found himself swept along by Churchill's relentless energy. Yet something profound happened. He began to understand why this man, rumpled, eccentric, with a cigar in hand and fire in his eyes, had become the symbol of Britain's defiance. When Roosevelt later asked Hopkins what he would report back, Hopkins quoted the Bible: "Whither thou goest, I will go." Churchill wept again. Hopkins returned to Washington convinced. He told Roosevelt, "The British need our help, urgently." Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt listened and agreed. The gears of American aid began to turn. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler was growing restless. Impatient with Britain's stubborn resistance, he turned his gaze eastward to the Soviet Union. But before marching toward Moscow, he gave Goering one final order: destroy the RAF, once and for all. The storm wasn't over, it was only shifting direction. On March 11, 1941, Churchill received the call he had been waiting for. Harry Hopkins phoned from Washington. The Lend-Lease Act has passed. At last, the U.S. Congress had approved Roosevelt's plan. America would send high-quality destroyers and military aid to Britain. For Churchill, it felt like salvation. He decided to celebrate in his own eccentric way, wearing his favorite sky blue romper suit, a one-piece outfit of his own design. He turned on the gramophone, grabbed a rifle, and fired a few mock shots into the air. But the joy didn't last. Another German air raid was on its way. When William Averill Harriman, the new U.S. envoy, arrived in London, Churchill led him to the rooftop to witness the fury firsthand. As the bombs fell, Churchill, eyes blazing, quoted Tennyson, heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew. The war in the skies raged on, and bad news poured in from abroad. The Nazi general, Erwin Rommel, the infamous Desert Fox, was crushing British forces in North Africa and the Middle East. In the Balkans, Bulgaria had joined the Axis. Churchill grew irritable and weary. By April 1941, hundreds of bombs had already fallen on London. Amid both domestic and military crises, Parliament called for a debate on the war's progress. Churchill, defiant as ever, responded by demanding a national referendum, a move that stunned even his allies. And then came the night of May 10th, 1941. Hitler's strategists convinced him to unleash every aircraft available against London. Shortly before 11 p.m., the first wave of bombers roared overhead. For 6 hours, over 500 planes swarmed the skies. They dropped thousands of bombs, turning the city into a blazing inferno. Westminster Hall was engulfed in flames. The British Museum was hit. Even the clock tower of Big Ben took a direct strike. The capital of the British Empire was burning. By dawn, 1,436 people were dead, the highest single-night death toll of the Blitz, and 12,000 Londoners were left homeless. It was the worst air raid in British history. And yet, through the smoke and the ash, Churchill's voice still echoed over the wireless. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. London had burned, but it had not fallen. While hundreds of German bombers rained fire upon London, one man in Hitler's inner circle was chasing a dream of peace. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, truly believed he could negotiate a truce with Britain. In secret, he made 4 reconnaissance flights to survey the route from Germany to Scotland. Before setting out on his final mission, he left behind letters, one for his wife and one for Hitler himself. On the evening of May 10th, 1941, as London burned beneath the Blitz, Hess climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf-110, flew across the North Sea, and parachuted into Scotland. Dazed but unhurt, he walked up to a guard post and calmly told the astonished sentries that he carried a vital secret message for the Duke of Hamilton. Major Alfred Donald, the officer on duty, could hardly believe what he was seeing. A senior Nazi official had flown alone into enemy territory to deliver a personal peace offer. With Donald's help, the Duke of Hamilton was informed, and the message reached Churchill. The British government had no interest whatsoever in negotiating. Churchill's response was brisk and unmistakable. Lock him in the tower. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Hitler exploded in fury upon reading Hesse's letter. He ordered the immediate arrest of all Hesse's aides and sent them to concentration camps. The bizarre incident sent shockwaves across both sides of the Atlantic. In London, the press feasted on it. One headline quipped, "Your Hesse is as good as mine." At gentlemen's clubs, the name Hesse was repeated so often that, as one reporter joked, the bar began to hiss like a nest of serpents. Even Roosevelt was baffled by the episode, unsure whether to laugh, shudder, or marvel at the madness of it all. For Churchill, though, the moment was poetic. As bombs still fell over Britain, even the enemy's mind was beginning to fracture. For 8 relentless months, London endured hell. From September 7th, 1940 to May 11th, 1941, nearly 29,000 Londoners were killed and more than 28,000 severely injured. Across Britain, over 44,000 lives were lost, among them 5,000 children. Yet even through fire and rubble, the city stood. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sky grew quieter. After the night of May 11th, the bombings began to fade. In May, the death toll exceeded 5,600. By December, it had dropped to just 37. The Nazis had grown weary, worn down by the unbreakable defiance of the British people and by one stubborn man named Winston Churchill. By June 1941, Hitler's grand new campaign, Operation Barbarossa, was underway. He had expected to crush the Soviet Union in 3 weeks. Instead, his armies found themselves swallowed by the vastness of Russia, battling snow, steel, and sheer resistance. And then, in December 1941, the world changed again. One evening, while listening to the BBC with his family, Churchill heard a report that would alter history. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. He leapt to his feet. "We shall declare war on Japan," he shouted. The next day, he did. Just hours after Roosevelt, Churchill's lifelong wish had come true. America was in the war. The Allies were united. Victory was now a matter of when, not if. His doctor later said he had never seen the Prime Minister so radiant. That Christmas, Churchill traveled to Washington for a state visit. When Roosevelt entered his guest room, he found the British leader completely naked, a cigar in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other. "You see, Mr. President," Churchill declared with a grin, "I have nothing to hide." For the next hour, he strode around the room in nothing but a towel, discussing grand strategy, cracking jokes, and toasting to their shared destiny. In his first year as Prime Minister, Winston Churchill had done the impossible. He gave his people courage when logic demanded despair. He taught them that bombs could break buildings, but not the British spirit. Through sheer will, he won over Roosevelt, and with him, the might of the United States. In doing so, he changed not only the course of the war, but the course of the world. Out of fire came faith. Out of ruin came resilience. And out of one man's stubborn courage came the salvation of a nation. Finishing The Splendid and the Vile feels like emerging from the smoke and rubble of wartime London, exhausted, moved, and strangely uplifted. Erik Larson doesn't just retell history, he recreates it. Through his vivid storytelling, you can almost hear the distant wail of air raid sirens, smell the acrid smoke of bombed-out streets, and see Churchill standing on the rooftop of 10 Downing Street, cigar in hand, defying the darkness above him. What makes this book extraordinary is not the scale of the war, but the intimacy of the moments within it. Larson takes us inside Churchill's private world, his eccentric habits, his flashes of temper, his humor in despair, and his absolute refusal to surrender. We see him not as the bronze statue of legend, but as a man of contradictions, brilliant and exhausting, emotional and fearless, utterly human. And that's where the beauty of the splendid and the vile lies. It is not a story about victory in battle, but about endurance of spirit. It's about how courage can be contagious, how leadership is often equal parts chaos and genius, and how even in the darkest nights, words, not weapons, can hold a nation together. By the end, I understood why Larson chose this title. The splendid and the vile are not opposites. They coexist in every chapter, every scene, every heartbeat of wartime Britain. Out of horror came resilience. Out of fear came unity. Out of one man's defiance came hope for millions. Reading this book reminded me that history is not just about events, but about emotions, the quiet courage of ordinary people, the stubborn fire of one leader, and the miracle of a city that refused to burn. When I closed the last page, I felt gratitude, not only for Churchill's unyielding resolve, but for Larson's gift of reminding us what it truly means to stand firm when the world falls apart.